Hello and welcome to our Making Meaning series. This is session 5, Weather as Muse, Art that Embraces, Images, and Collaborates with the Weather. Presented by Margaret Lejeune. My name is Donald Hyatt. This program is presented from Rochester Public Library Arts Division. Thank you for joining us. Margaret is an image maker, educator, and independent curator originally from Rochester, New York. She holds an MFA from Visual Studies Workshop. Her creative practice examines art, science, and place-based research. In 2023, Margaret was named the Woman Science Photographer of the Year by the Royal Photographic Society in the UK. She currently serves as the Barstow Artist in Residence at the Central Michigan University and is a member of the board of directors for the Society for Photographic Education. And with that, I leave this to Margaret, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Today, we will be talking about weather as muse. In this session, we're going to explore artists who are inspired by weather-related phenomena. This work will include artists who generate their own weather, those who work in collaboration with shifting weather patterns, and those who incorporate scientific and meteorological data into their creative practice. Okay, so weather has influenced significant events throughout human history. Sometimes these events are tied to climate change, and other times they represent anomalies that affect air travel or launched eras of famine or disease. Chinese scientist Shen Cao is believed to be the first person to study climate. In his 1088 Dream Pool essay, he ponders climate change after finding petrified bamboo in a habitat that wouldn't support such growth in his lifetime. Since then, inventions and technological advances have allowed people to track the weather over time, and in some cases, even to control it. Around 1602, Galileo was the first to conceptualize a thermometer that could quantify temperature, allowing people to track changes in heat. The air conditioner made its first appearance in 1902, and in 1974, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations held a classified briefing on the results of Operation Popeye, a 5-year cloud seeding experiment designed to lengthen Vietnam's monsoon season, destabilizing enemy forces there and allowing the US to win the war. But far more often than humanity seeks to control the weather controls us. To clarify, weather refers to the sort of short-term atmospheric conditions for how much sun or what temperatures you might experience in the next week, while climate refers to long-term changes in overall weather trends over long periods of time, such as decades or millennia. These two are impacted by each other. Climate change affects the severity and frequency of weather events, and the costs of extreme weather events rise as the effects of climate change become more apparent. To begin our look at weather, I've selected several representations here. These are Greek, Maori people of New Zealand, Norse, and Aztec mythology. Each of these figures that were thought to control the weather in these cultures. We're going to begin today by looking at the work of Hokusai. He was a Japanese artist in the Edo period. Hokusai was best known for his woodblock prints, but he worked in a variety of mediums, including painting and book illustration. Starting as a young child, he continued working and improving his style until his death when he was 88 years old. So he had a very long and successful career, and he produced over 30,000 paintings, sketches, woodblock prints, and images for picture books in his lifetime. He helped bring the use of perspective to Japan, which had been embraced in European art for several centuries before his working career. In turn, Hokusai's paintings and woodblock prints had a profound impact on the development of 19th century European painters like Manet, Monet, and Van Gogh. They began to make paintings of common events and ordinary people and used simpler, more abstract shapes with bold outlines. So Hokusai's career, he began as an apprentice to a woodcarver when he was a teenager, and then he worked in a traditional studio which produced stylized paintings of middle-class life. Once he began working independently, he started to focus more on everyday life and environments of common people and where they worked, things like that. So when he was in his mid-70s, he made his most well-known works. It was a series of prints called 36 Views of Mount Fuji, in which Mount Fuji is the backdrop to different scenes of everyday life. In this example from the series, we see the strength of the wind, which can be felt and seen by the blowing hats and papers of the people on the road. The artist carefully rendered the power and unpredictable nature of wind as an invisible force. The papers, the hats, they fly around in the foreground and the middle ground, showing humans at the mercy of the weather. This image of Mount Fuji was made between 1830 and 1832. The distinctive peak is seen in the distance beyond a small shop. It was one of Hokusai's beloved series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji, that I just mentioned. And it has that iconic mountain as the focal point. It also serves as a foil. It depicts sort of daily life, social customs, and the seasonal nuances of weather. So Hokusai made these enormously popular images about the time that the price of a particularly rich, resonant blue pigment was falling and becoming more widely available to Japanese artists. And so we see that blue in all of these images. Some of the images in this series show stormy weather, some more very turbulent scenes, such as the Great Wave, which is, the most famous work from the series, in which Fuji is dwarfed by this curling and cresting wave. That blue seems essential to the sense of fair weather in this image, along with the auspicious wind that keeps the kites afloat. If this is a scene from, say, Edo or Tokyo, that means that the right side of the image would be north and that the winds are from the cool direction. That would trigger more precipitation on the northwest side of Fuji. And so in the south or to the left, we see less snow. And given that the kites are pushing from right to left, it looks like a cold front has just passed through. And that white in the sky may not be haze, but rather distant storm clouds pushing through offshore. That would place a cold front just a little south of Japan in the East China Sea, maybe pushing toward the south of Japan and over Taiwan. This is Hokusai's best known work, and again, it's from the series 36 Views of Mount Fuji, in which he uses that Prussian blue color that I mentioned had been falling in price. This really revolutionized Japanese printmaking at that time. The composition of the Great Wave is a synthesis of traditional Japanese prints and uses a very graphical perspective, which had been developed in Europe, and it earned him immediate success in Japan and later in Europe, where Hokusai inspired many of the Impressionists, as I had mentioned before. Several museums throughout the world hold copies of the Great Wave print, many of which came from 19th century private collections. Only about 100 prints, which are in varying condition, are still around. The Great Wave has been described as possibly the most reproduced image in art history, as well as being contender for the most famous artwork in Japanese history. The landscape is composed of 3 elements: a very stormy sea, 3 boats, and a mountain, Mount Fuji. The artist's signature is visible in the upper left-hand corner of the picture as well. So in the background, we have Mount Fuji and its snow-capped summit. The dark color surrounding the mountain appears to indicate the painting is set in the early morning, with the sun rising from the viewer's vantage point and beginning to illuminate the snowy peak. There are cumulonimbus clouds between the mountain and the viewer. Although these clouds typically indicate a storm, there is no rain on Fuji or in the main scene, which is closer to us. The sea really dominates this composition, which is based on the shape of a wave that spreads out and dominates the entire scene before it falls. At this point, the wave forms a perfect spiral, right? And so in the center, passing through the center of the design, it allows the viewer to see Mount Fuji at the center of that circle. The image is made up of curves, with the water surface being extension of the curves inside the waves themselves. And this wave is generally referred to as something that would have been produced by a tsunami, a giant wave, or more likely it was simply a rogue wave, but also as a monstrous and sort of ghostly wave with a white skeleton that threatens the fishermen with its sort of claw-like foam at the top. As you will see throughout the remainder of this talk, Hokusai has continued to be an inspiration to many artists whose work investigates weather. Halfway around the world, the landscape painters Turner and Constable were influential in the Romantic period, an artistic movement of the late 17th to the mid 1800s that really emphasized emotional responses to nature. Turner, who traveled extensively, often infused his dramatic seascapes and landscapes with literary or historical allusions. And Constable, who never left England, preferred more straightforward depictions of placid rural scenery. In this image, we see a work by Turner depicting a very different representation of a boat at sea than we saw in Hokusai's Great Wave. The boat is terrifyingly caught in the vortex of a snowstorm. The swirling clouds of snow and whipped up sea almost seem to envelop it. The painting is rather abstract. It's about 100 years before abstract expressionism became, sort of the hottest style in the art world. Turner said that he wasn't trying to capture what a storm looked like, but more what it felt like. So really a precursor to that abstract movement. He said, quote, "I did not paint it to be understood, but I wished to show what such a scene was like," unquote. This was painted by Turner in 1842, and he applied the paint in a swirling motion, easily giving the feeling that the boat is in the center of a very intense storm. This is one of Turner's more daring paintings. In a battle between modern machine and nature, a steamboat faces a blizzard. Its black fumes are sort of swirling in the vortex of the sea and the snow. And then this is another very famous work where Turner is painting a ship amongst a storm. Here we see the main protagonist as the weather in an image called The Slave Ship. The first impression that the painting creates is that of an enormous, deep red sunset over a stormy sea. It's an indication of an approaching typhoon. This ominous typhoon is further indicated by an approaching dramatized storm cloud creeping in from the left side of the canvas. Upon really close inspection, you can see that there is a ship sailing off in the distance. And this ship is identifiable as a type of fast vessel that was used by enslavers to escape Navy patrollers. In the right foreground, a single dark leg juts out from the water with an iron chain locked around its ankle. It is thought that Turner was influenced by the 1781 incident in which the captain of a slave ship that was bound for Jamaica, the ship was called the Zong, had ordered 132 slaves to be thrown overboard when drinking water was running low, so that his insurance payments could be collected on those slaves, because slaves who died of natural causes were not covered by insurance. This incident went to court, and the trial that ensued gained wide public attention, building support for the abolition of slavery. Turner's emphasis on color rather than design is typical of the Romantic painters of this time. The sort of the shapes that we see and the sort of pervasiveness of the sunset blood color really serve to illustrate the idea that nature is superior to man or humans. Turner's intentions became apparent when painting is considered in relation to the circumstances of the actual Zong incident, which didn't actually happen during a storm, but occurred in calm waters. So Turner included this impending typhoon and sunset to comment on the atrocities of slavery and slave trade. Other colors in the painting, such as the cool blue of the ocean and the black caps of the water, bring the ocean's thrashing movement to life and give the viewer a sense of this cataclysmic nature of the scene. The painting might be viewed as an allegory against the exploitation of slaves and other human labor in favor of machines and economic advancement, represented by the coming storm engulfing the cruel captain's ship. However, the storm could also be viewed as representation of nature's dominance over humans and the ultimate futility in trying to industrialize and advance society. So John Constable was also part of the Romantic period, but he took a very different approach from Turner, and he more often painted directly from scenes that he saw, sometimes even painting plein air or outdoors, rather than in his studio and from sketches as Turner did. Turner often painted from his imagination as well, and that just wasn't something that Constable did very often. This stormy painting is thought to reflect John Constable worries about the effects of political reform on the Anglican Church. This is called Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, which Constable began painting in 1830, and it shows the cathedral from the northwest. The spire pierces a sky that is full of billowing clouds. Dark rain clouds hang directly above, and streaks of lightning flash over the roof. But a magnificent rainbow arches over all, sort of promising that the storm will pass. While the tall trees in the middle distance on the left are shaken by what looks like a squall or a breeze, the river surface is already smooth and glossy. Fresh raindrops glint and sparkle on the brambles in the foreground, and the painting remained in the artist's studio, which he continued to retouch until his death in 1837. So as I mentioned, Constable was an ardent supporter of the Anglican Church. Partly for this reason, the storm depicted in Salisbury's Cathedral from the Meadows has been interpreted as reflecting Constable's fear for the future of the established church in England. He already saw that the church was being weakened by the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829, and then increasingly threatened by the growing agitation towards a reform bill, which was passed in 1832. Constable didn't paint the Salisbury Cathedral as obsessively as Hokusai painted Mount Fuji, but he depicted it in several important works under strikingly different atmospheric conditions. One of the stormier depictions is sometimes seen as his comment on those sort of troubled state of affairs in England in the early 19th century with the church. In this image, the church isn't the focus. Indeed, if anyone has ever tried to photograph a monumental object, one knows that you must fit the whole thing in by backing away. And so far, as you can see in this work, the cathedral becomes much smaller and the sky seems to take over the scene. Roughly 40 years later in North America, George Henry Dury was depicting rural weather scenes, which became popular when reproduced as lithographs by Currier and Ives. So despite early success in painting people, Dury gradually turned his attention away from portraiture to the increasingly popular field of landscape painting. His work captured the particular qualities of the local landscape in addition to depicting the daily way of life of his friends and neighbors. As a result, Dury's body of work is unique within the context of 19th century American art, standing as a compelling synthesis of both landscape and genre painting. Hunters in the Woods, which is dated to 1860, is Dury's largest canvas. It's 36 by 54 inches. And Dury's pride in his painting is really seen in this picture. Not only is his signature on the bottom left-hand corner very obvious, this canvas is really large, and he was really thinking about the Hudson River School painters at this time. This is kind of his answer to what Cropsey and Kensett and Church were doing. His style kind of meets the basic requirements of the Hudson River School painters. The view is wide, the subject appears very noble, the canvas is large, and the technique is thin with high technical polish, should we say. So where Dury stops short of Durant and Church's technique is in the verisimilitude of the detail. Another American painter, this is German-born Albert Bierstadt. He endured numerous hardships in his quest to paint what he thought was the raw nature of the 19th century. He made several expeditions into the mountains of the American West. The bulk of the nation's citizens at that time hugged the coasts, so he was really determined to show them what he considered to be the majesty of the interior. With a local guide and provisions that he packed on mules, he headed into the Rockies, sort of west of Denver, and he would sketch whatever he saw. In this image, a storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie, which he painted in 1866, he depicts this sort of hallucinatory scene that greeted him as he emerged from a really wet forest. He, really was thinking about Turner's word sublime as he's making this work, He really marveled at the clouds so low that they were being torn between the land and the river. He was really interested in the way that these rolling masses and storms sort of drifted through these valleys. This was virgin territory, and it seemed to him as if the landscape was being formed by the storm itself. So he makes this sort of a tribute spot, not only to the art that he wanted to create and the views that he wanted to show the people living on the coasts of America, but he also named the peak, the towering peak in the distance, Mount Rosalie, and he named this after his wife. So in the early 1890s, Claude Monet worked on 30 canvases, all of them depicting the facade of the Rouen Cathedral. This is a Gothic cathedral in the Normandy region of France. This cathedral was built over a span of about 800 years, and it was Rouen's most famous landmark. And generations of artists before Monet had painted this cathedral, but no one painted it in the way that Monet did. The weather at Normandy can turn very quickly. It can go from bright and sunny to murky and gray in a heartbeat. So Monet decided that his approach would be to take several canvases and paint them simultaneously. So he would rotate them on and off the easel by the half hour or simply as the light changed. He hoped for good weather when he was painting, but both winters were unusually miserable and gray. And as spring approached, the light became stronger and starker and created more vertical lines on the facade of the cathedral. So the paintings were propositions that, for all of their beauty, a cathedral facade is merely another configuration of elements, right? So no different from a cloud, if you will. Follow me for a moment here with this. Some have speculated that Monet wasn't painting the cathedral at all, but rather the ever-shifting envelope of air around it. In the 1890s, Monet's expression of transience must have felt awesome. He was embracing a vision that, while staying true to the by then century-old tenets of plein air easel painting, also pointed forward to ideas of existentialism and postmodernism. In the mid-19th century, we have also the simultaneous invention of photography in England and in France. However, the first images of snowflakes don't come until William Bentley creates these in the United States in Jericho, Vermont. He was a farmer by trade, and he attracted world attention with his pioneering work in microphotography. The notable work that he did was on rain, dew, and frost, and he worked extensively with snowflakes. And in 1855, he became the first person to photograph a single snow crystal. And I'm showing you a variety of them here. All snowflakes are different and varied, and these are absolutely stunning and remarkable images that he created sometime between 1855 and his death in 1931. He went on to photograph over 5,000 snow crystals, and his documentation of this work advanced the field of meteorology at the time. His photographs were acquired by institutions of higher learning all over the world, and his writing on these subjects were published in many journals and magazines, some that are still around today: Scientific America, Nat Geo, and the National Weather Service Research Journal. Alfred Stieglitz was another American photographer. He lived from 1864 to 1946, and he also was very interested in atmospheric conditions such as snow. On the left-hand side, we see a winter scene of Fifth Avenue in New York. This was taken in 1892. And on the right is a picture titled Two Towers from New York from 1913. These two pictures are examples of Stieglitz's street photography, where he would walk the street looking for arresting images to capture with his camera. These two contrast, winter's brutality, if you will. On the left-hand side, the image captures, kind of a peaceful winter day with snow balance, or I should say on the right-hand side, we've got winter sort of peaceful day. The snow is balancing on the branches and on the handrails. And on the left-hand side, we have this brutal scene of the horse-drawn carriage through the snow. In the summer of 1922, Stieglitz began to take photographs of clouds, tilting his camera toward the sky to produce these very dizzying and abstract images of the ethereal forms. In an article the following year, Stieglitz maintained that these works were a culmination of everything that he had learned about photography in his previous 40 years. And I quote, "Through clouds, I wanted to put down my philosophy of life, to show that my photographs were not due to subject matter, not to special trees or faces or interiors, to special privileges. Clouds were there for everyone, no tax on them, they are free," unquote. And over the next 8 years, he made some 350 photographs of cloud studies, largely reproduced as contact prints on silver gelatin postcard stock. Stieglitz called these photographs the equivalents. More than describing the visible surface of things, the works could express pure emotion, he thought, paralleling the artist's own inner state. Stieglitz, along with many of the artists in his circle, argued that visual art could assume the same non-representational, emotionally evocative qualities as music. Indeed, he actually used music as an inspiration for the equivalents and gave the early works titles that had to do with music. In 1922, he named one Music, a sequence of 10 cloud photographs, and in 1923, one called Songs of the Sky. Stieglitz's partner was also attracted to clouds and weather. This is an abstraction that Georgia O'Keeffe painted, looking at the sky for inspiration. This horizontal landscape depicts a very dark silhouette of mountains with gray, wavy clouds on a black foreground. Above the hills, the sky is orange, and the gray swirling clouds loom above these, above the expanding edges and out beyond the canvas almost. This is another work where she's expanding clouds and using abstract forms to represent clouds, but this one is obviously very different. This is one of several paintings that she made after seeing clouds from in a plane. In this case, O'Keeffe very carefully ordered the clouds and seemed to do the opposite of what Stieglitz was after. She's trying to orient us in relation to them, not disorient us. And the relationship seems to be nurturing, as if the clouds form almost a protective skin full of orderly cells around the earth. This painting inspires joy, rather like Hokusai's beautiful blue skies, an almost tactile sense of the atmosphere as something that sustains and protects us. Up until this point, we've been looking at artists who've been depicting weather or using weather as a metaphor in their works. In Condensation Cubes, one of Hans Hake's early works, the artist is making weather and conceptual art. Interested in biology and ecology and cybernetics. In the mid-60s, Hake was influenced by the idea that a living organism is an open system that continuously changes depending on its dialogue or its interaction with the environment. So Hake's early works, such as Condensation Cube, transpose this concept into the realm of art. In 1963, he began producing works that incorporated plexiglass containers filled with water. Condensation Cube exemplifies his interest in the basic physical processes as evaporation and condensation of water. Because of the temperature differential between the inside and the outside of the cube, the water vapor condenses into droplets and then runs down the walls of the cube, taking on very random forms and patterns. This piece really sort of summarizes Hake's interest in closed physical systems, biological growth, and random movement, right, of the water, while emphasizing the idea that art that has lost its representative and referential ability to emerge as a state of affairs. So Hake himself explained, Quote, "The conditions are comparable to a living organism, which reacts in a flexible manner to its surroundings. The image of condensation cannot be precisely predicted. It is changing freely, bound only by statistical elements. I like this freedom," he said. A physical process as basic as water condensation allowed this artist to redefine not only the work of art as a living system, but most significantly, the role of the viewer or the user, if you will, of art. While the patterns of water trails within the cube have to do with the condition of their immediate surroundings, the human presence is also part of the environment. So the artwork depends on the physical presence of the viewers who, by proximity, modify the work unwittingly. Thus, the artist incorporates the viewer into the art in a very innovative way. Susan Hiller's Dedicated to the Unknown Artist features over 300 found postcards depicting storm waves crashing onto shores around Britain. The artwork includes a large map marked with each location of the featured postcards. The spectacular nature of the weather is contrasted with the mundanity of these throwaway postcards. The title of the work suggests that Hiller is paying tribute to the overlooked and forgotten artists who painted, photographed, or hand-tinted these numerous seaside images. In 1977, Hiller discussed the work in the following way. Dedicated to the Unknown Artist was designed as an exhibition piece with myself in the role of the curator, collaborating with or extending the work of the unknown artist who created the Rough Sea set of postcards. The coincidental pairings of alternative descriptive languages, the visual and the verbal, are sustained as levels of presentation throughout the work. While the charts may look like models of objectivity and the visual images like expressions of subjective internalizations, they lead to a series of paradoxes involving the unexpressed but intended versus the expressed but unintended. The work illustrates Hiller's interest in the subject of memory and memorials, right? And the idea of memory and memorial of storms and weather. But by making such commonplace objects the subjects of a dedicated and extensive presentation, Hiller gives new status to the mundane and provides the viewer with a familiar access point from which to engage the work. This work has also been described as a work about invisibility. The group of postcards only came to exist as a set, quote unquote, by the artist's act of collecting them. And the visual correspondence that the collection highlights would have been previously unseen had they not been all gathered together. So Hiller's choice of sublime or picturesque seaside motifs and their subtext of romantic desire, the soul in turmoil, or perhaps a longing for nature, contrasts with a strict conceptual methodology. Colored images in particular were generally excluded from contemporaneous conceptual frameworks of art. So yet for this work, Hiller opted to make the genre of popular color postcards of the British seaside her prime focus. However, the grid formation, the serial presentation, and the type labeling all recall the language of conceptualism. David Hockney is another British artist, a very popular English painter, a draftsman, printmaker. He's also a stage designer and a photographer. He was born in 1937, and he was an important contributor to the art pop movement, I should say the pop art movement in the 1960s. He is considered to be one of the most influential British artists of the 20th century, but he was very inspired by 19th century Japanese woodblock prints by Hokusai and Impressionist painters such as Claude Monet. So as you can see, we keep coming back to a few of these key figures throughout art history who are really inspiring people to think about weather and landscape and atmosphere. Both of those artists, Monet and Hokusai, depicted a wide range of atmospheric and lighting conditions in serial formats. Hokusai with his images of Mount Fuji, And Monet, with his really well-known paintings of grain stacks, Rouen Cathedral, poplar trees, so many things that he did in serial. So these images that I'm showing you here from the series Mist, these are lithographs, and in these, they really seem to recall Monet's paintings of poplar trees along the river Epi. Hockey's print, or I should say, yeah, David Hockney's print, The Wind, which we see here, is part of a 6 print series that depicts all different kinds of weather. And this one was directly influenced by Hokusai's print, Traveler Caught in a Sudden Breeze from the Mount Fuji series. Here he's used the same idea of swirling sheets of paper where we were seeing hats and paper swirling in the landscape. Here we see these sheets of paper that are caught in gusts of wind, and they're set in the environment that Hockney was living in at that time, and they're being blown around a California freeway. You can see on the bottom right side of the image, we've got a sign for Melrose Avenue. And for the past 50 years, the Japanese artist Fujiko Nakija, I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing her name wrong, Fujiko Nakiya, has gained international stardom for these fabulous ephemeral sculptures made with fog. These are enchanting installations. She has done them at Guggenheim in Spain, in the Australian National Gallery in Canberra, and several other places. And these were just really awe-inspiring. They're sort of this synthesis of technology and art coming together. She is known globally for her work with fog, and she initially specialized in oil painting. She studied in Madrid and then in Paris before she moved to the United States, and she went to school at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Her father was a global authority on snowflake formation and glaciology, and he really nurtured an interest in her in nature and its mechanics. So in her really early work, she translated her father's influence into paintings of things like rotting flowers and dissolving clouds, sort of transient natural processes of decomposition. After she went to school in the States, so she returns to Japan, and she has this really important meeting with the groundbreaking US artist Robert Rauschenberg. And it changed Nakija's work forever. In 1967, Rauschenberg had just founded the Experiments in Art and Technology Group, EAT it was called, which was a visionary organization aimed at facilitating a collaboration between artists and engineers. And she became Tokyo's representative of that group. And a few years later, she produced the first fog sculpture at the Pepsi Pavilion at the Expo, which was Expo 1970, which was Japan's first global art fair. And these are definitely driven by her ecological concerns. She's really interested in the idea of water and air as mediums that have really particular resonance, resonance, I should say, in this era of the climate crisis. She is introducing air and water in this sense of fog as a sculptural element, and it's really a metaphor for the sort of endless temporal processes that are a link to material reality. Her cross-disciplinary approach becomes evident in the titles of her fog work. She sequences the numbers of the nearest weather stations, and she then uses those numbers to label the works. And so the data from those weather stations are the preparatory planning that goes into making each fog sculpture, because she needs to know the specific atmospheric conditions of the place at a particular time to be able to make the fog work. The next piece we're going to look at is called A Sudden Gust of Wind. And again, we're seeing a reference to Hokusai's, really beautiful series about Mount Fuji. This is a large color photograph. It's displayed in a light box. So it's an image that is printed on a very large transparency that is then backlit, so it seems to sort of glow from within. And what it depicts is a flat, open landscape. There are four figures in the foreground that appear frozen as they respond to what is a sudden gust of wind. It is based on that woodcut travelers caught in a sudden breeze. And the way that Wall makes his images is very different from most photographers. He sometimes spends months photographing actors, in this case, in a landscape outside his hometown in Vancouver. And what he tried to do is to photograph at the sort of similar weather conditions over this 5-month period. And then he collages together elements from the photographs digitally in order to achieve the desired composition. So the result is a tableau which appears staged in the manner of classical painting. So as in Hokusai's original, we see two men who are clutching their hats with their hands. There's a third that stares up into the sky, and his things are being carried away by the wind. On the very left-hand side, we have a woman who appears to be kind of in shock. Her head is concealed by her scarf that's been blown around her face, and a sheaf of paper that's in her hands is being dispersed by this huge gust. And you can see their trajectory up and over the center of the image. It really creates a dynamic sense of movement across the picture plane. There are two narrow trees also in the foreground. They're actually bent by the force of the wind, and they release their leaves, which seem to commingle in the air with those floating papers. In Hokusai's image of the landscape, there's a curving path that leads through a reed-filled area next to a lake, and Mount Fuji's in the distance. But in Wall's version, we have this very flat brown field. It abuts a canal. There's a small shack, a row of telephone poles, some concrete pillars, piping that seems to evoke this very industrial farming area. The pathway on which the figures stand in the foreground is a dirt track. It extends along the front of the photograph from one side to the other. And there's really no sense of connection between the characters. Their position in the landscape appears rather incongruous. I'm also going to share with you this work, which is a study that Jeff Wall did, and it really clarifies the method with which he works. It shows the landscape in black and white. We have those four figures superimposed on it. And then above them, the series of papers in the sky, each marked with a red cross and annotated with numbers. And Wall explained that this is how he put together all of those images that he shot over the 5 months that he was doing, the photographing. So you can see that in the work, it's crossed by a grid of diagonal and vertical lines. And this is to help the artist with mapping the positioning of the picture's components. Those two spindly trees on the left-hand side of the image are actually collaged in from another piece of paper. They are presumably not in their final position, as the trunk of the smaller one is misaligned near the base, as you can see, indicating a place where the artist has cut and pasted these, parts of the picture together. To the left of the trees is a patch containing three small figures working in a bare field. This was also reworked in the final image, and only one of those figures remains. A close comparison between the study and the final work reveals shifts in the position of the pages that are floating through the air, highlighting the process of experimentation carried out by creating this composition in these various study forms. The next artist we're going to talk about is Ronnie Horn. Ronnie Horn is an American artist who's been fascinated with weather and its effects, and I should say the effects that weather often has on landscape. She has spent a lot of time in Iceland, where extreme weather dominates the environment. And the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is Horn's first photographic installation. It was called You Are the Weather. It was done in 1994 through 1996. And it's a photographic cycle featuring 100 close-up shots of the same woman named Margaret. She is positioned in a variety of Icelandic geothermal pools. And in each image, the woman's facial expression changes with the changes in the weather conditions around her. And so Horn said about this work, the way this work is shot and installed, you are surrounded by a woman who is staring at you. This suggests that the viewer takes the place of the weather to which the young woman is responding. Another artist really influenced by weather is Olafur Eliasson. I talked about Eliasson in one of my previous talks here for the library. I find his work to be really inspirational and quite stunning, and his body of work is quite large and complex. In 2003 and in 2004, he seemingly brought the sun into the Tate Modern in an installation that he called the Weather Project. This was installed in Turbine Hall, and it represents the sun and the sky sort of dominating this expanse inside the building. A fine mist was sprayed throughout the space, and it feels as though that mist was sort of creeping in from outside of the environment or the building. And throughout the day, as the mist sort of accumulates into these faint cloud-like formations, it gets heavier and heavier in the room, and it helps to disperse the light that we see from the sun. In making the work, Eliasson was really interested in exploring ideas about the viewer's experience and their connection to what they are experiencing. So when the Weather Project was shown in the Tate Modern, one of the things that Eliasson found to be most sort of moving and interesting was the way that viewers responded by sort of spontaneously laying on the floor of the museum and looking up as if they were sunbathing or looking up to experience the power of the sun in this work. And in this scene here, you can see that sort of atmosphere, that almost sort of haze that Eliasson has been able to create in the gallery space. I love this work. This is such a beautiful body of work. Excuse me. This is Bernalt Smiled, and he is a sculptor. These works called Nimbus are, again, short durational works, sort of similar to the fog sculptures that we just looked at. These last about 10 seconds, just long enough to be photographed. And Smiled was really interested in the ethereal, right? So he makes these perfect sort of miniature clouds in a diverse array of interior spaces, everything from coal mines to cathedrals. And his materials are, little more than smoke mixed with water vapor. And what results from those two things put together is different size and shape clouds depending on the atmospheric conditions of the location in which he's photographing. So the foundation for all of this is a space that has to be cold and it has to be damp with no air circulation. Otherwise, the cloud would disperse or it wouldn't form at all to begin with. So Smiled creates a wall of water vapor with the type of spritzer that you might use on houseplants, and then a smoke machine that sends off a quick puff or a faux cloud of fog. And these two things are then on a collision course together. And once they hit each other, you get this beautiful puffy cloud. And he said that he likes to keep his clouds no larger than 6 feet because he noticed that after making them larger, they would dissipate even more quickly than those 10 seconds that he really enjoyed photographing. He said that he didn't want the clouds to fall apart too quickly. He really wanted them to be concentrated and full of lots of puffy texture. So he usually spends a few days tinkering with the formula to get the cloud, perfect for the space in which he is working. For one shoot, he might make 100 different clouds to get the image. And the results are quite stunning. These ephemeral artworks are caught on camera and then they disappear. The locations are often very bare where he shoots. They're very simple because he really wants to be able to showcase that cloud. He has to work very quickly. Sometimes he does not photograph these himself. He hires photographers to do the work for him. He likes to work with photographers who have experience shooting architecture so that the wood, the metal, and the windows, the other elements in the scene are in sharp focus in contrast to these soft, fluffy clouds. And one of the things that he said about this work is, quote, "I see them as temporary sculptures of almost nothing, the edge of materiality. It looks like you can dive into them or grab them, but they just fall apart. There's a duality that I really like, where you're trying to achieve this ideal thing that then collapses just moments later," unquote. Another artist working with clouds is Yi, and she was really interested in how we participate in the idea of atmosphere. And her thought is that by merely breathing, we are helping to shape and change the atmosphere. And many folks who talk about the climate crisis and the idea of the Anthropocene as a geological period or a period in time are thinking about those very ideas. So this work is called "The Breath from Which the Cloud is Formed." It's a series of 50 cloud and some cloud-like images that are arranged in a grid. So half of the images are photographs of real cloud formations. Think back to Stieglitz's equivalent series, while the rest are these fluffy white impressions that the artist has made by breathing her warm breath onto a special heat-sensitive paper. So she's literally contributed to the atmosphere, and she's reminding us that human activity is the dominant destructive force on the planet, as we have all contributed. Commemorating the 10th anniversary of both Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita in the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, Judy Nuttall's "Another Storm is Coming" was a commissioned piece by the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences at Rice University. She did this in collaboration with PhotoFest International Biennial, which was held in Houston, Texas. So the land and the water between New Orleans and Houston, which is commonly referred to as the Energy Coast, is a region that has been equally devastated by hurricanes, flooding, loss of wetlands, and the rise of the ocean. And there's also the ever-present reality of the devastating oil spills that has, just devastated animals, ecosystems, and humanity. Nuttall stumbled upon a piece of graffiti that included the phrase "Another storm is coming" in an abandoned amusement park that was blown to shreds by Katrina. And this was situated along the Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. So she instantly recognized this as a prophecy and as poetry and the sort of truth of the phrase. So she uses this fitting title for her project, and she's really thinking about how with each cycle of hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast, that the folks who are living there are reliving the stories of a repetitive cycle of loss and devastation due to this increase in horrible weather events. The area is haunted by stories of people who have lived through these drastic flooding and storms. And the Gulf waters continue to warm. And as those waters warm, we're going to continue to see more and more intense weather events in this area. And as Nuttall says, another storm is coming. Natalie Maibach's sculptures are something, just an amazing inspiration to me as an artist. These works are about the chaotic weather events that they depict. They are really colorful sculptures that turn weather data especially data from extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, typhoons, floods, into art. So she uses basket weaving techniques as the foundation for her work. Her work is sculptural and is densely layered, and it's weaving things like barometric pressure readings, rainfall totals, actual tweets by hurricane victims, all together into the work. This piece that we're looking at here is called The Burden of Every Drop. And in here, she creates a chronological representation of Puerto Rico's struggle to survive the intense wind and rainstorm from Hurricane Maria. This piece takes on the tone of a tragic opera, if you will, by dividing the hurricane into 4 stages, featuring downed power lines to represent the island's effort to keep its electrical grid intact through the storm. So within this sculpture, you're really able to see how the storm affected different areas and how people responded differently to things that were happening during the storm. This piece was inspired by Hurricane Sandy, and it translates numerical data. And in this case, she's using that data to build amusement park rides. So they suggest the narrative of what coastal life may have been like, and perhaps what future life might be like living with climate change. So this work translated weather and ocean data from October 29th to the 30th in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy devastated the Atlantic coast. This work, A Storm Within a Storm Within a Storm, was about Hurricane Maria, again, from Puerto Rico's, the devastation in Puerto Rico's infrastructure. This combined weather data from both Maria and Irma that did a double whammy in the Caribbean. And that weather data is translated into what kind of looks like a ship and a windmill. And all of this is positioned up atop a precarious tower of rafts. And then she did this work, which is a little closer to home. This is about the town of Waverly, Tennessee. It was heavily damaged by a flood on August 21st, 2021, after a series of thunderstorms unleashed a torrential downpour that turned into flash flooding. And this all happened during the COVID pandemic. And so this series is partially about weaving together how the communities were dealing with weather-related events and disasters amid the COVID pandemic. So the data includes weather data from the flooding and the rain, and COVID-19 data from the specific town of Waverly, Tennessee. And you can see the river flowing through in the center of the work, and waves that appear to come up from the right-hand side. This piece is called Stay Healthy and Stay Strong. It was created in December of 2021 and 22. And again, this is a translation of weather data that includes cloud cover, temperature, and wind from various locations that the artist and her family resided during the month of December 2021, which included Lyon, France, Daytona Beach, Florida, and Boston, Massachusetts. So this was the month that the Omicron variant popped up in many countries. And so again, this is the layering of severe weather events, changing weather data, and COVID rates and COVID infections. Isabella Young was working at the same time, also during the pandemic. The image we're seeing here is called the 20th of April, 2020, pH 7.1. And Young is an environmentally conscious artist. She uses rain and other atmospheric processes as an inspiration and a participant in the creation of her art. So one of her projects focused on anthropogenic emissions, such as carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and several others. But what she saw was that her country of New Zealand, when it began lockdown on March 25th of 2020, she was really interested in how those emissions would change during lockdown and how it would change the air and the rain quality. So she began taking rain samples during her home during lockdown, and she would do these pH tests to measure the acidity or the alkalinity of the rain. And then she created a small series of 2 paintings, one that was done on April 20th, 2020, during what was called the level 4 lockdown, and then another one done on May 3rd when the restrictions had been lifted. And so the color of the paint for each work was closely matched with the acidity of the rain taken on her pH samples. So there was one that was 7.1, and then 6.7 pH showed a significant difference when they were out of lockdown versus when they were in lockdown. So the works were installed in White Cliff Studios, and I really love how the installation was created. There were these meteorological instruments and apparatus that were attached to some of the paintings, but this pair was mounted on a pivoting mount, and attached to the back of the canvas was a hinge so that the painting could be angled up toward the sky. So it almost looked like it would catch the rain, that could be falling from the sky on it. And then a pH strip, what she was using to test the rain, was installed on the back of the painting. And that would really, help enable a dialogue or a discussion about, the acidic quality of the rain. Some more works that I wanted to show you from Eliason. These were created in 2023, and these works are circular artworks that were made by a specially designed drawing mechanism and painting machine that he created in the desert near Doha. So this exhibition was created for the National Museum of Qatar, and Eliason made these drawing machines. He started doing them in the late 1990s. And it was a project that he did in collaboration with his father, who was also an artist and a sailor. And they were really interested in making these machines together. And so what the machine did is it uses the elements of chance, but also natural phenomena such as wind, to create markings in ink and in paint, in color pencil, on circular sheets of paper or canvas. So the drawing machines that were conceived for the Qatar exhibition were installed in a circular pavilion that was open on the top to the sun and the weather. And the forces of nature were enlisted to help create these, what he called indexical portraits of a specific place at a specific time. So 2 circular canvases, one white and one black, would slowly turn as motors that had water in them mixed respectively black and white paint pigment and dripped it down onto the spinning surfaces. So the wind would cause these pendulums that extended above the pavilion walls to move, and the drawing utensils would then cross over the canvases. I hope you can see I'm moving my arms to try to show you what this would look like, leaving these undulating marks that directly reflected the weather condition at the time. Absolutely brilliant, these sort of wind drawings. Okay, so climate has unquestionably affected the development of different cultures, but rapid changes in weather have also been critical in both mundane and historical moments. And I mentioned this all the way back at the beginning of the lecture. The success or failure of military endeavors, the safe start to a space journey for, say, the space shuttle, a random encounter with a person that leads to unexpected consequences for an entire family tree. All of these things can come from weather-related events. Oh, I don't want to go outside today. I don't have an umbrella. I'm canceling my date. Those kinds of things. So the science of meteorology developed in tandem, though, with the military needs to predict the weather. Those that had the best weather forecasting had the best advantage on the battlefield. So the military strategic maps and languages were transferred to the weather map. This means they could depict warm fronts and cold fronts, battling for the control of airspace. And eventually, this evolved into sort of a common scientific language with symbols for various types of weather and meteorological phenomena. So in 1873, the first European synoptic weather map was drawn by the Swedish Weather Forecasting Bureau. They were called MCA. So synoptic is Greek and it stands for simultaneous or contemporary. And this relates to the measurement used as the base for drawing the map. So this information was obtained at a large number of places across Europe simultaneously. And what we're looking at here is an installation from Bigert and Bergstrom, and it's called Inside the Weather, a synoptic battlefield. So this allows the viewer to actually enter into a sculptural installation that is a weather map. And so here we have the signs of weather, hot fronts and cold fronts, isobars, wind arrows, hail and thunder. You've probably seen all of these images before when you've watched your meteorologist on your daily news. And here we have it materialized in the form of standing sculptures and hanging mobiles, some of them made out of these really highly reflective stainless steel parts. This particular piece calls data from 5 historical events that are then transformed into the sculpture. And these were different battles that happened throughout history, essentially. The first one is from a typhoon. The next one is from a hailstorm that sparked the French Revolution. We've got Napoleon's frozen field campaign in Russia. And then we have D-Day on June 6 in 1944. Crystal Forest is another installation by Bigert and Bergstrom. It consists of 5 ice shard-like sculptures, which shapes were inspired by images of nuclear-powered submarines rising to the surface and through the frozen ice caps in the North Pole. Around that submarine tower, the ice floes have formed into pieces of broken shards. They look like glass. And in this sculpture, they have made broken glass pieces that are printed with UV inks. And the images then are formed together a 360-degree panorama of a forest landscape. So the title Crystal Forest originates from Ballard's 1966 book, The Crystal Forest, in which a leper doctor travels on a river in Cameroon into a jungle stricken with disease. The trees and animals have begun to crystallize and turn into precious stones. And successively, the plague spreads to other parts of the world, and nature undergoes a total transformation where even the people are caught in crystallized shells as they greedily try to harvest the newfound riches. So B&B are really using this, book as a metaphor for what they're seeing is happening in our current climate crisis. Today, nature faces a similar threat as human-generated carbon dioxide emissions create rising temperatures and dramatic changes at all levels of our biosphere. And I'm going to finish up today with the beautiful work of South African artist Haneen Conradie. She has been focusing recently on deadly flooding that has become a worldwide issue. Conradie said that when Cyclone Freddie hit Malawi in 2023, and I experienced the distress it caused, I started to track flooding across the globe. Water is a powerful substance with the capacity to transform a place unrecognizably. In the aftermath of its raging, settled water, has the ability to dissolve sound. It is this quality of stillness after a catastrophe that I found most compelling about floods. For me, these moments are steeped with beauty and with grief, with immense awe and the devastation of loss. Conradie works with organic plant material to create these drawings. She also uses earth, so river clay that she collects in Worcester, South Africa, where her maternal family farmed is part of her process. And she also incorporates burnt plant material in her practice. This process stems from working with an indigenous plant in her area called Finbos. And it's a plant in the Cape, which has to be burned in order to propagate. Thus, like the phoenix from the ashes, this burnt plant material represents hope that she sees and rebirth. Thank you for joining us today. If you have been enjoying this series, I hope you will add our next event to your calendar. On Wednesday, June 12th, we will host the lecture Beyond Sunsets, Poetry and Metaphor in the Landscape. In this talk, I will be looking at work that moves beyond documentation of place to investigate broader concepts within the landscape, including social, political, environmental, and cultural influences. I hope to see all of you then.
All right. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we head off? I'd love to hear anybody if they have any questions.
I had a question, not about some of what you've got, but I wonder if you've ever had a chance to go over to the Memorial Art Gallery. Have you seen that work, the Martyrs, Fire, Air, what is it, Earth, and you know the one I'm talking about?
I have not
probably
been
seen
to,
it.
I used to go to the Memorial Art Gallery all the time as a kid, but I haven't lived in Rochester in many, many years, though I'm moving back soon, and now I'm going to have to go check it out. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, so it's there are 4 video panels, and each panel represents one of the elements,
Hmm.
and they're people, but they're being martyred, I guess, by the element. So one guy is sitting in a chair, and like little drops of flames are coming down
Hmm.
until like the whole room is on fire. And then there's one where somebody's like tied up and the wind is like blowing them around. And then there's one that gets covered with dirt. And then the water one is just, just what you would expect, water pouring down on somebody. So it's really interesting. And you sit there and you watch the different videos. So they're kind of life size.
Okay.
It's upstairs where the organ is.
Okay.
You know, that room with the organ. So
Yeah.
if you go up there, it's pretty cool. The other thing I was going to tell you about that you might enjoy or you might know about is there's an artist in Singapore. Her name, her, him, I'm not sure, is Wen Hui, and they have this series called Nice Aunties,
Hmm.
and it's AI generated imagery of it's mostly a commentary on the environment, but it's like these older women in juxtaposed in the environment. So like it's like an old lady like laying on the beach wrapped in plastic and
Hmm.
stuff like that. It's the coolest thing. So look it up,
I will.
niceaunties.com. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I'll definitely. Thank you
It's
very much.
nice aunties, all one word.
Okay.
I had a question on if you've had any, did you ever see the exhibit? I think it was at the Met with the rain where you walk through in the sensors and it's the experience of walking through but not getting wet.
Yes.
You just have any experience to talk about that at all or anything?
I haven't seen it in person, but I know that work. So it makes you think that you're going to walk into a rainstorm, but instead, when you walk into it, the sensors actually stop the water so you don't actually get wet. But it's an optical illusion making you think, right? And so it seems to be a bit about control, right? What controls the environment? Who controls the environment? Um, how does our brain work to deceive us, right? Or conceive ideas. Yeah, I think that that is a really fascinating work as well.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else before we head off?
Oh, I had a question on one of the Hokusai
Mhm.
pictures. You know the one that's got the kites flying off the roof?
Yeah.
The guy on the roof, is he dropping something on the other guy? Like it looks like he's throwing like sandbags or something.
Yeah, I believe that they are working in a shop, and so that they are
Okay.
moving materials, um, from one worker to the next worker. I believe that's what's happening.
When I was in Hawaii, at the museum in Honolulu, they had a bunch of hokusai, and they're so fun to look at. He's almost, you know, a bit. You can tell that he's got or had quite a sense of humor. Some
Absolutely.
of the stuff that's going on with the people, like when you're like really get close, it's like, wait a minute, what's he doing? Yeah,
Yes.
it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I really enjoy that about his work. It was, just sort of looking at that whole body of work and thinking about the sort of like genre that in which he is just making images about everyday life, right? But using the weather as this sort of, um, I don't know, the thing to tie that it all together, right? Allows us to feel at one with each of the individual characters, if you will, in the prints, right? We've all had that moment where the wind has gusted and our umbrella has overturned or our hat has blown off. And it's like this uniquely human experience that we are experiencing, this moment of folly, if you will, right? That we're that despite our best efforts, that the weather and the environment will always, actually be the one in control, if you will. So I don't know. I think that Hokusai was quite funny. And I think you pointing that out is something I've thought quite a bit about in looking at his work as well. He had to laugh at life. And, that to me, I find very charming.
I see that a little bit in Hayao Miyazaki in the anime that he does.
Mhm.
With very, very down to earth, but yet, there's always a comment about the environment and that kind of thing. But he's got, sometimes a gust of wind will come and just, things fly up, and yeah, I'm wondering, if he also, I'm sure he did, learn about Hokusai as a art student.
Yeah. I would imagine that in any illustration program, the Hokusai would be someone that you would look at as, just part of your art historical training, because he influenced so many people. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
All right, we will cut the recording at that. And thank you again for joining us and hope to see you next month.
All
Okie
right.
doke. Bye
Take
bye.
care.